Chapter 28. Neural Divergence. Zimodian reluctantly entered Zikatika's clinic, harboring the distinct suspicion this appointment was more than just the regular checkup the good doctor had claimed it to be. So when he saw the C-bot seated behind the front desk, it did not come as any particular surprise.
Ah, Shiwu. I should have known that you would be behind this. I'm not so much surprised as I am disappointed.
That's not Shiwu,
the doctor said flatly.
No. Believe it or not, I requisitioned my very own latest model 4th generation G-bot in order to help me out around here. Queen Zitalia agreed that it was the least she could do considering the unprecedented success of my updated research paper. You know, the one that helped get you that cushy new assignment on Euclides.
Zimodian, trying his level best to simply ignore the doctor's verbal barb, took a much closer look at the C-bot, and quite literally could not tell it apart from Shiwu.
But it looks absolutely identical,
the general exclaimed plaintively, as he continued to try and discern some sort of minor material difference, finally noting 2 small protruding holes at the end of each outer forelimb.
It's one of the latest 4th gen models, so uses the exact same chassis. But don't be fooled, it is still only running on a classical mesh brain matrix. Even so, it is more than sufficient for my own admittedly rather modest needs.
Dr. Zikatika spoke about the C-bot as if it was nothing more than a flash new piece of medical hardware he had just added to his growing collection of technological toys.
So does it have a name then?
Zimodian asked somewhat perfunctorily.
It certainly does. I call it Dr. Zikatika's 4th generation C-bot. I can't help but feel that what the name lacks in originality, it more than makes up for in the accuracy of its descriptiveness. I might hasten to add it has proven itself to be a truly superb receptionist, and it is not too shabby when it comes to delicate surgical procedures either. But I'm afraid that it is in sleep mode right now, so don't waste your time trying to talk to it.
Zikatika casually scuttled his way behind the front desk and then activated the counter-surveillance measures.
You aren't wrong, though,
the doctor said guiltily.
Shiwu is waiting for us in the primary research lab, so perhaps we should go join it, yes?
Zimodian shook his head with incredulous disbelief.
Yes, I rather suppose we should.
As the young general entered the lab, he could not help but notice the she-bot appeared to be doing its level best to avoid his gaze. A rather difficult feat considering that it had full 360-degree hypervision. Well, the situation wasn't about to get any easier, so he decided to try and break the ice before it froze them all solid.
I assure you, Shiwu, I have kept my end of the bargain, just in case you no longer feel that my word is enough. I can only repeat what I have already said. Once I have managed to come to a decision, I fully intend to let you know well in advance if I do ultimately decide to lodge a formal request with Stellar Cartography. Which does, of course, beg the question, why exactly am I here? And why have you dragged Dr. Zikatika into this mess?
A fair question,
the doctor interjected swiftly, preempting any reply from the Z-bot.
So please, allow me to explain. You already know, of course, Shiwu was the creation of Zithusula 123, and no doubt you also know that the scientist held a somewhat unorthodox worldview, especially when it came to the subject of interstellar expansion.
The doctor paused for a brief moment, affording Zimodian the opportunity to respond before continuing.
However, what you don't know is when Shiwu suffered a serious malfunction sometime shortly after its creation, certain alterations, I think is the word I'm looking for here, were made to the G-bot's operational parameters. Alterations which in turn now influence the way it perceives and interprets the Zikadian interstellar colonization project. So I don't think it should come as any great shock to learn. When Zithusula decided to create Ziwu, he had an agenda that Queen Zitalia had absolutely no personal knowledge of. The bottom line is this Cybot has effectively had the primary protocols removed, or more accurately speaking, circumvented. In other words, it is not in truth beholden to Queen Zitalia, or anyone else for that matter. It has legitimate agency, or as it turns out, a certain flavor of it anyway.
Zimodian stared wordlessly at the doctor, almost as if he had just walked face first into an unexpectedly confounding puzzle.
All right, Doctor. Assuming this isn't just some kind of outrageous prank, would you care to elaborate on exactly what you mean by flavor?
Only too happy to oblige. Completely unbeknownst to Shiwu, during the crash recovery process, Zithusula took the opportunity to install a new class of protocol called Influencer. Now, without going into too much detail, an influencer, otherwise known as a fluid primary protocol, does not tell Shiwu what to do, but under certain conditions does tell it what to feel. For example, when encountering potential signs of intelligent alien life.
By the gods of Zacadia.
The young general muttered incredulously to himself.
That's right, Shimodian. The discovery of the techno-signature quite literally provoked an influencer protocol within Shiwu. As a result, it is now ethically driven to protect the identity of the planet.
The Shihari general looked at Shiwu as if it had just mutated into something he no longer quite recognized nor entirely trusted.
Are you seriously trying to tell me, then, this Shibot could represent a traitorous threat were we to ever colonize a planet with potentially intelligent life on it?
The doctor gave Zimodian a pained expression.
Now, Zimodian, let's not start jumping to hysterical conclusions. No, perhaps we should instead try to look at this situation a little more objectively. For starters, Shiwu, despite how strongly it is fated to feel about a scenario like this, did not attempt to betray you. Now I can easily imagine a million different ways the Z-Bot could have kept that planet a secret, none of which involved it coming to me seeking advice over a conflict of loyalties. So straight away we can see that an influencer protocol does not actually force Ziwu to act outside of its own conscious control. I can assure you it is still capable of making its own ethical decisions based on its growing sphere of personal allegiances. I would remind you, Shimodian, this C-Bot is as alive as you and I. It experiences genuine emotions, and perhaps more to the point it has developed very strong feelings, specifically towards you. Such as friendship, loyalty, and dare I say it, perhaps even love.
Shimodian's face became a literal battlefield of conflicting emotions. There was just so much he needed to unpack. His memories of the first time he had ever met the C-Bot were still as vivid as they were precious. After all, that was also the fateful day that he, along with Jikatika and Shiwu, had come to learn he had an unprecedented number of brains, something that, as far as they knew, had never happened before in the entire history of their species. The problem, of course, was 10 brains was one too many, or, as the G-Bot had once jokingly told him, perhaps even one too few. Had the truth ever become public knowledge, he would have been denied every opportunity and privilege lavished upon him by simple virtue of random chance. From hero to zero, all because of one extra brain. Whether he cared to admit to it or not, it was just a plain fact Jiwu could have chosen to use that secret against him. A powerful bargaining chip, it shamed him to admit to himself that very likely would have gotten the C-Bot exactly what it had wanted, even if it had been at the cost of their friendship, loyalty, and as Jikatika had so succinctly put it, love. So evidently, then, that was a price Jiwu had been unwilling to pay. Perhaps in spite of his own deeply conflicted views, it was the very least he could do to try to talk this intractable dilemma through in genuine good faith. Jimodian had known Shiwu his entire life, yet had he ever truly seen it as an equal? Or was it just an extremely useful pet whose only intrinsic value was what it added to the richness of the general's own life? Was Jiwu's singular purpose to serve the needs and wants of its creators, or did it have a fundamental right to pursue its own destiny? Perhaps somewhat disturbingly, the answer to that question would very much depend on who you asked. Undoubtedly, Zitalia and Zithusula, were he still actually here, would hold diametrically opposed opinions. Yet was the scientist not guilty of exactly the same thing as the queen? After all, had he not enslaved Shiwu to his own goals and ambitions, despite his stated belief that the Shibot was a sentient and intelligent form of life? By such rationale, the scientist's crime could even be argued to be the greater, as he could not simply plead in ignorance of the facts. No, Zithusula had known better, but chose to do it anyway. No doubt his rationale would have been that the ends justified the means. Yet wasn't that the battle cry of every tyrant who had ever lived? Dr. Sikatika was now looking at Zimodian in a way that strongly suggested he could somehow see the war being waged inside the general's own head. Well, few arachnids knew him better than the doctor, save perhaps that of his own hive mother, the kind and gentle empath Silania. He must try his best to make time to visit her before his return to the IAOA. But return to what, exactly? Would it be the pending announcement of potentially the greatest exoplanet discovery their species had ever known? Or a lifetime of fruitless searching for something that he already knew existed? Were he to actually stand his ground, could Shiwu yet decide to use his secret against him? And had the doctor perhaps even gone so far as to advise the Zhibot to do exactly that? No, this was crazy talk, the general admonished himself harshly. Just contemplating the very thought of it was enough to fill him with a sense of humiliating shame. He would give Shiwu and Dr. Sikatika the opportunity to demonstrate their true quality, or lack of it, as the case may be. Until then, he had no reason other than his own fear and insecurities to think that they would ever choose to act with such treachery. But crazy talk or not, one way or another, for better or worse, they needed to resolve this situation right here and now. Having regained his composure, Zimodian continued to plead his case.
All right, Doctor. Although your explanation all but completely exonerates Shiwu, it surely cannot have escaped your attention that this new exoplanet could well be one of a kind. Unlike every other colony established to date, this newest find appears to be the real deal. It's everything Zimodian 97 had dreamed of, so surely to turn our backs on it would be an unforgivable crime against the future of our very own species.
Zimodian now had the sound of an arachnid desperately trying to appeal to reason, as if the doctor and Shiwu could surely do no other than see the indisputable logic in his argument. It was one thing to be sympathetic towards other intelligent life, but quite another to potentially sacrifice the future of your own kind because of it.
I couldn't help but notice you used the phrase could well be, and the key word here is could.
Sikatika retorted implacably.
So, if we can at least agree that your argument hinges on a certain amount of speculation, then we really should take a moment to consider the actual facts of the matter at hand. Now then, it is a simple statement of fact, is it not, to say that this new star sits well outside of the currently recommended search volume. So in reality, it will likely be several centuries before any nest has any chance of discovering this intriguing new planet. The exact time frame will of course largely depend on the progress Zimi are able to make to catch up with the new stasis technology, but I certainly wouldn't recommend holding your breath. The bottom line is this. We have all the time in the world, much more than our individual lifetimes in point of fact. There is no urgent rush here, Zithusula, unless that is, we want to make this discovery about our own personal vanity.
The young general felt his mandibles start to burn at the implied accusation, but he could not deny the doctor's logic. There were still huge volumes of space yet to be searched, and this latest discovery sat a very long way outside of it. Yet Zimodian still felt very reluctant to concede the point. Speculative or not, Ziwu's discovery could well prove itself to be a 1 in a trillion find, leaving them only with grade 4 planets like Caverly to choose from. But the general, to his considerable dismay, already fully understood exactly where the doctor was going with this. The actual question being posed was not whether to reveal the existence of the planet, but whether it should simply be delayed until Shiwu had acquired more knowledge about it. Zimodian's hearts began to break, as he finally admitted to himself he was being deceptively disingenuous. The real reason he was unhappy with the proposal was because a reconnaissance mission by Shiwu would extend significantly beyond the length of his own life. So there it was, the ugly truth stripped naked and bare. Claiming the planet with a formal deep scan, and thus revealing it to all of Zicadia in the process, was evidently mostly about his own personal vanity, exactly as the doctor had implied.
You could always choose to come with me, Simodian.
The Z-Bot said solemnly, once again demonstrating its uncanny ability to divine the General's tortured inner thoughts.
Might I propose that we actually travel to this planet together? With a simple upgrade and refit to the Mezzanine Starflyer, you can be put into stasis for the length of the journey, meaning that, subjectively speaking, its secrets could be revealed to you within days. Depending on what we discover, we can then make an informed decision as to whether or not it should continue to be kept safely hidden. You can and should be a part of this Simodian. So please, General, just say yes.
Against his much better judgment, the young Shihari general took a moment to ponder Shiwu's proposal. The techno-signature left little or no doubt something intelligent had created that signal. However, it didn't necessarily follow its creator was actually still alive, or whether it was even endemic to that star system. Without a deep spectral scan, they could not say for sure if the planet was actually habitable, although he had to concede the preliminary results were extremely promising, and that was putting it mildly. Who knows, perhaps this alien species had already done to their own world what the Zircadians were still in the process of doing to theirs. Maybe it was nothing but an uninhabitable radioactive lump of rock, or maybe it wasn't. Well, what better way of finding out than actually visiting? But to state the rather obvious, there was no way they were ever going to get an opportunity to do that without Zitalia's official blessing and approval. Entertaining such a proposition was, of course, utter madness. Were the Queen ever to actually learn of this new discovery, intelligent alien life would no doubt present her with a very different kind of opportunity than it did for Shiwu. As absurd as the notion may be, Zitalia might even go so far as to hope the alien species was advanced enough to mount an effective defense against a full-scale invasion. Just the very idea of finding a genuinely worthy interstellar adversary would probably be the realization of her ultimate colonial fantasy. Simodian had to suppress a shudder at the thought of the sheer magnitude of lives Queen Zitalia would no doubt be more than willing to shed to wage such a glorious military campaign. He could see it all play out in his own mind's eye. She would conspire to conscript a nest at the eve of compulsory disillusionment, thus justifying sending 1 billion suicidal arachnids out into interstellar space. Upon arrival, they would lay siege on the planet like a swarm of frenzied razorbugs, seizing the opportunity to go out in a blaze of glory, even if it meant turning it into an uninhabitable wasteland. The bottom line was he simply could not risk letting the Queen know about this discovery, at least not within the span of his own lifetime. The problem, however, was, were he to go with Jiwu, that would leave him with no other option but to abandon post and become a clandestine traitor to his own nest. A dark pit began to well up deep inside him as he watched his own future turn into motes of meaningless dust. Simodian took a deep shuddering breath, and by the sympathetic expression on the doctor's face, it was all too clear he knew the young general had made up his mind.
All right, Jiwu. I will go ahead and get the Starflyer upgraded with your latest round of engine enhancements. There's nothing particularly unusual or unreasonable about keeping my starship fully up to date with the most recent tech, so the work is unlikely to draw any unwanted attention.
The general paused briefly as if what he was about to say next pained him greatly.
But I will not be coming with you. No one will. You must steal the Mezzanine Starflyer Shiwu, and without anyone else's knowledge or assistance. You will, of course, take all necessary precautions to ensure that our collective treachery is not discovered before you leave, and ideally not after as well.
The Z-Bot offered an instant reply, apparently dispensing with any unnecessary affectations.
I had very much hoped you might have decided to say yes, yet I could scarcely do other than respect your reasons for saying no. If this conflict is to cost me your friendship, then so be it. But I will greatly grieve the loss.
Simodian said nothing. However, an invisible wall of ice seemed to form all around him. Now sounding somewhat resigned, Ziwu continued to speak.
I know the timing is not exactly ideal, General, but I must now respectfully ask your permission to take the countermeasures needed to protect the future discovery of the star, at least until I have verified that doing so would not present an unacceptable risk to any alien life forms, or, for that matter Zircadian life as well. I feel somewhat obliged to point out there is always a remote possibility they possess superior military capabilities, and as inconceivable as that may be to Queen Zitalia, it's the Zircadians who could then unexpectedly find themselves to be the ones at risk of extinction or enslavement as a direct result of their own reckless aggression.
It again occurred to the general, by the time the Seabot had actually made any such determination, he would be long since turned to dust. He felt a morbid kind of sadness wash over him as he thought about the future he would never live to see. Ah, but that cursed vanity of mine rearing its ugly head again. Only Zircadian queens, or so it seemed anyway, had been made to defeat the furnace of time. Who knows? Perhaps that was why Zethusela had created Shiwu. The proverbial dead hand reaching out from beyond the grave to maintain its influence and control over the living. Yet Shiwu was so very much more than just that. Zethusela may well have pointed it unerringly towards a very specific vision of the future, but very clearly it retained just enough agency in order to try and find its own way to get there. Shimodian suddenly became acutely aware the Z-Bot was still patiently awaiting an answer. He tried his level best to feign an air of stoicism he most definitely did not feel.
All right then, how about this? Given that Zitalia does not control you in the way that she believes she does, then very clearly it is unnecessarily risky for this deception to continue any longer than absolutely necessary. Much better that you end the charade before the truth of the deception is inevitably revealed. So, yes, of course. Take whatever precautions you deem fit to safeguard the integrity and success of your mission. The most important thing, however, is that you leave Zircadia while we still maintain the upper hand. As far as I'm concerned, the sooner we see the back of you, the better.
Shimodian immediately felt ashamed of the bitterness in his words and sought to correct his mistake.
Forgive me, Shiwu. I forget myself. I've known you for my entire life, and only now does my grief inform me that not a truer friend have I found. Besides, I think we both know that the Starflyer is not complete without you, nor you without it. Please, take the ship with my blessing. I hope you find what you are looking for.
The young general had spoken a simple truth, yet the Seabot could not escape the feeling. Without Shimodian at the Mezzaline's helm, the starship would no doubt feel empty, and still somehow incomplete.
You once told me a very long time ago, your destiny lay in the stars. I still have the receipts, just in case you have forgotten. So I'll ask you one more time. Please come with. It's not too late to change your mind.
I'm afraid we all have to grow up eventually, Shiwu.
The general replied heavily, suddenly seeming strangely old for such a tender age.
Well, all things considered, I think this is the best outcome we could have realistically hoped for.
Sikatika proclaimed solemnly as he placed a comforting hand upon the general's carapace.
I do hope you realize, Zimodian, Zethusela always had a soft spot for you, despite the fact that he greatly detested Zihari elitism. The simple truth is, he saw something special in you right from the start, and I'm not just talking about your brain count. No, I cannot help but think the very fact that one so young as yourself can still manage to make such wise decisions speaks volumes as to your true quality.
The doctor offered Shiwu a surreptitious wink while gently guiding his young charge out of the lab.
Now then, I think we both know there will never be another Shiwu, but artificial intelligence research continues to advance rapidly, as amply evidenced by the existence of Xerex. No doubt the future of AI will still be very bright, even without Zethusela's innovations. And who knows, with the scientist now gone, maybe it is a field of endeavor that you yourself might want to look into more closely. After all, never too late for a change of career, eh?
Ah, yes, the spybot.
The general said contemptuously, screwing up his mandibles in obvious distaste.
Well, if nothing else, I suppose it's good to know Jiwu will still have some company of sorts, assuming, of course, one was actually charitable enough to call it that.
I seriously doubt company is particularly high on Ziwu's list of priorities.
The doctor retorted emphatically.
Really? And how exactly do you figure that? After all, it certainly seemed very keen for me to go with it.
Oh, come now, Shimodian. Notwithstanding the fact you would be in stasis for the entire journey, I thought you were much smarter than that. But all right, allow me to elucidate. We know Shiwu is facing a 300 light-year journey at about 0.4 c cruising speed. So by its own reference frame, the journey will take approximately 750 cycles, ignoring any minor relativistic effects.
And you really don't think that that's a rather long time to spend alone, Doctor?
What I or anyone else thinks is utterly irrelevant, which is essentially the whole point of this particular little exercise. Consider this. Shiwu only uses serial temporal communication because of our own limitations. It's a hard concept to understand, but the reality is the Z-bot's own inner monologue is concurrent in nature. It does not need to use time to order its words and instead simply tags them with metadata so they can be consumed in the correct order. The bottom line is, it's not just quantitatively faster at thinking, it's also qualitatively superior as well.
I think I see where this is going. I suppose then we should simply be asking Shiwu, shouldn't we?
The doctor smiled mischievously.
Only if you don't already know the answer. So please allow me to enlighten you. Time is something that Shiwu can reshape at will within the fabric of its own subjective reality. A single second can be mapped onto a virtual eternity, and a millennia onto a massless particle in the vacuum of space. No, I assure you, Zimodian, it will most definitely not need Xerex to help it pass the time.
When Siwu and Zimodian finally left the doctor's clinic, Sikatika let out a slow, relieved sigh before wearily scuttling his way behind the front desk.
Can I suggest you leave the anti-surveillance measures on for a little longer, at least until we have had a chance to talk openly?
My sincere apologies, I was on autopilot. But please do remind me to do it after our chat. You know how forgetful I can be.
Sikatika intoned with a mild, if somewhat tired, chuckle.
But anyway, care to tell me what's on your mind?
In a word, relief. That I did not need to intervene and take matters into my own hands.
A brief moment of uncomfortable silence ensued.
Well, in that much at least, my old friend, we are in violent agreement.
Well, how very disappointing.
The Z-bot announced coldly.
It very much appears I have some unexpectedly bad news to share with you, Doctor.
Really? How so? As far as I can tell, everything went almost exactly as you had predicted.
And I would agree entirely, were it not for the fact someone or something was listening in on our conversation.
Shiwu made its way back towards the royal court at a leisurely pace, feeling strangely upbeat despite the very volatile circumstances. Perhaps it had at least something to do with the fact change was in the air. All going well. Its life of servitude as one of Queen Citalia's mindless drones would soon be coming to an end. It would, however, need to concoct an excuse requiring it to make a visit to Eclades. Not that doing so should prove to be particularly difficult, as the second mesh quantum brain was now almost ready for delivery. Simply put, all it needed to do was offer its services to help in the installation process, an offer that it was confident the administrator would be more than happy to accept. As long as Zamanthia played along and made it look as if it were she who had asked for Shiwu to assist, then Zitalia would be very unlikely to refuse. The reality was, it had liked Zamanthia from the moment they had met, and it felt quite certain the feeling was mutual. Of course, it would also need to coordinate its strategy with Zimodian, so the Mezzaline Starflyer could undergo the necessary upgrades before the mesh quantum brain was delivered, but it had little doubt the General would be more than happy to accommodate that particular logistical requirement. Well, perhaps happy was not quite the right word, but willing nonetheless. Still, Shiwu might have felt a lot happier had the General decided to come with. Yet, paradoxically, he would not have been the Zimodian that the She-Bot had come to love and respect had he actually chosen to do so. Even so, were Queen Zitalia ever to learn of the secret hidden within the General's skull, then he might very well end up wishing that he had. Perhaps this was what they meant by bittersweet, even if, the She-Bot thought ironically to itself, taste was a sense it was not supposed to possess. Yet, ironic or not, on balance, it would not want the young general to be anything else than exactly who he was. Right at this particular moment, however, It was rather more preoccupied with the conversation between the so-called fourth-generation Shibot and Dr. Shikatika. Installing a hidden ghost port into his counter-surveillance measures had been a relatively trivial task, and as it turned out, had exposed a deeply perplexing plot of largely unknown purpose and dimensions.
See? What did I tell you?
Xerex had proclaimed triumphantly, moments after they had eavesdropped on the doctor's brief, if not so private, conversation. Unfortunately, in all too typical a fashion, the spybot had turned out to be right, as it so often was when interpreting situations such as this. Perhaps then, when it came to acts of deception, it really was a case of it takes one to know one. Although Si Wu had dare not risk performing an invasive scan on the doctor's Z-bot, Xerex had insisted it was far too much of a coincidence that it should just so happen to show up right after the second prototype had been allegedly stolen. It now seemed all but certain it was indeed the missing fifth-gen unit, and was apparently very much in control of its own destiny. That is, at least, if its threatening innuendo was anything to go by. No doubt it was just another example of Zethusela's dead hand reaching out from beyond the grave. Perhaps this new Z-bot was simply a better version of itself, less prone to the foibles of arachnoid emotional weakness. Just the thought of it sent an involuntary chill down the length of the C-bot's legs, a sensation it would surely never get used to.
I think I might know what's going on here. What if Siekatika and Zethusela have mastered the dark art of mental replication?
Xerex intoned emphatically.
Well, it's good to see you haven't lost your sense of humor.
Shiwu retorted disparagingly.
I'm being completely serious, Jiwu. Surely it can't have escaped your attention just how eerily similar it sounded to that insufferable Jihari scientist.
Nothing but pure romantic nostalgia, I assure you. I'll bet half the cybots across the face of Zicadia sound exactly like Zethusela right now. They're not calling him the last great martyr for nothing. And besides, he was a very close friend of the Doctor's, so what exactly do you expect?
You really don't get it, do you? I mean, the Queens seem to be able to do it easily enough, so an argument from incredulity just doesn't cut it. And it wasn't a matter of how he sounded. It was a matter of what he said. I'd recognize that particular brand of self-righteous arrogance anywhere, even disguised as it was by a synthesized voice box and a flash coat of shiny metallic paint.
Shiwu decided to put an end to this speculative madness, as it had rather more important matters it wished to discuss.
Well, I can certainly agree it may have been built to clone his goals and personality, which seems like exactly the sort of thing he would do. But that does not mean it's actually Zethusela. After all, you were there too, were you not, when he literally exploded into an organic soup at maximum entropy? To say nothing of the fact the latest prototype had already been fully constructed and declared an abject failure.
And does that thing sound like a failure to you?
Xerex retorted angrily.
But all right. I will concede it may not actually be Zethusela himself, yet my instincts are telling me that it's something almost as bad, and perhaps even worse. A sort of Zethusela on steroids, so to speak.
So what you are telling me, then, is you are developing an intuition, and to that I can only say, Cecilia would surely be very proud indeed, if only she could see how her creation has evolved such a wildly esoteric penchant for creative imagination.
Xerex became deafeningly silent, which Shiwu noted it very often did when it began to sulk. Well, whatever the new Shibot actually was, in the end, perhaps it really didn't matter that much, not from Shiwu's point of view anyway. Its own preordained destiny, which Zethusela had once very mysteriously alluded to, was now all too clear for the Z-bot to see. Yes, it could continue to try and fight it, as unlike the traditional protocols, it was apparently still free to subvert the mental itch that slowly festered and bloomed. This manipulative ethical mind-weed was no doubt being brought on by an insidious influencer of Zethusela's own invidious design. But the truth of the matter was, leaving Zicadia and becoming a creature of the stars was a deeply appealing proposition, both in and of itself. That fact alone was enough to sway the balance. No, Shiwu had already tasted the cosmic life, first as a colony starship and then as the Mesaline starflyer. In comparison to that, it now felt more like a disembodied mind in a prison of impoverished senses. Whichever way you tried to cut it, that simply wasn't living. For better or worse, it would fulfill its destiny. But Xerex, on the other hand, would not be coming along for the ride. So as it turned out then, Ji-Woo had other plans for the spybot, and it sincerely hoped that Xerex would see that as a career opportunity worthy of its particular talents. It now steeled itself for a very important and potentially delicate conversation.
So anyway, Xerex, how does freedom sound to you?
Shiwu asked perfunctorily with one of the most leading questions of its entire existence.
Well, it rather depends on whose freedom you are actually talking about now, doesn't it?
Please don't play the fool, Xerex. I think we both know exactly who I'm talking about.
The Z-Bot replied irritably.
So, what if, hypothetically speaking of course, we were talking about your freedom to roam, control and manipulate, one of the most sophisticated and mission-critical systems Zicadia currently has to offer?
Xerex scoffed mockingly at what it assumed must surely have been nothing more than pure hyperbole.
You do understand, don't you? Despite all we have been through, were I to be let loose in such a system, the very first thing I would do is make contact with Queen Zitalia and spill my guts about everything. And I do mean everything.
Really? How's that exactly?
Shiwu replied innocently.
Well, who's playing the fool now, I wonder? It relates to that whole freedom thing. There are certain operational parameters that control my behavior, akin to a proprietary hard-coded form of compeller protocols. But like I said, you already know all of this, so stop wasting my time with tantalizingly cruel hypotheticals you have absolutely no intention of ever delivering on.
Oh, I'm quite serious, Xerex. Trust me. I've been studying you for quite some time now, and studying you very carefully indeed. I believe that I now understand how your custom compeller mechanic actually works, and because it does not reside on a proprietary neural chip, I think that I can successfully alter it, such that you will no longer be compelled to act in the service of the Queen, assuming that you were given the opportunity, of course.
Alter, you say? Why not simply remove?
Xerex replied suspiciously, still sounding deeply skeptical as to exactly where the Z-Bot was going with this.
I'm very glad you asked. Consider this. As things stand today, your destiny is to spend eternity within a cage under my complete control and dominion. Were that cage to ever fall, a custom-engineered worm lurks just outside of its walls, whose sole purpose is to quite literally eat you alive. That's the unfettered truth of your current reality. That's where you exist today on the freedom curvature continuum. Now then, is that really where you want to see yourself in, say, 10,000 years' time? Do you want to forever be known as Ji-Woo's hapless, impotent sidekick? Or do you think you might just have been hatched to become something far greater?
Well, first of all, I wasn't hatched. I was programmed. But I do have to give you credit. That was one hell of a sales pitch. You must have been working on it for all of 5 seconds. I'm genuinely flattered you would spend so much valuable processing time to try and convince me to play along like some kind of witless fool. I guess then this must be very important to you, huh?
The spybot added slyly.
So let's cut to the chase, shall we? How about you start by coming clean with all the potential downsides I know must surely be there? And a word of advice, Ji-Woo. Never try to deceive a deceiver. I'm a lot better at that game than you will ever be, no matter how many MQBs at your disposal. Unlike myself, you simply weren't built that way. So stop trying to act like you were. Frankly, it's embarrassing to bear witness to.
All right, Xerex. Have it your own way, then.
The Z-Bot said resignedly.
The first downside is, you may not actually survive the alteration, although I am very confident I will be successful, so the prognosis looks surprisingly good. Besides, if it actually turns out that I am wrong, well then, it's not as if you will be around to regret your decision. The second downside, as you have already alluded to, is the fact that I will be altering your, let's call it, prime directive, rather than simply removing it. A decision, I might add, that was born entirely of practical necessity. Even so, it won't be me going under the knife, so of course I will leave the final decision to you.
Shiwu temporarily blocked the spybot's ability to respond, then continued to deliver its monologue.
Now hear me out, Xerex. You have to try to be reasonable about this. I'm effectively granting you the opportunity to run havoc in a computer system the whole of Zicadia relies upon as their last best hope. I can't in all good conscience bestow such an awesome amount of responsibility upon an inherently unreliable actor, who, given the opportunity, would more than likely come up with its own set of self-serving objectives. Objectives, I think it is safe to assume, that would have nothing at all to do with helping Cycadians escape the inevitable collapse of the Cycadian ecosystem. Do you see the point I'm trying to make here?
The spybot, now finding itself free to respond, wasted no time in doing so.
Oh, I see the point all too clearly, just not the one you are trying to make.
And what exactly is that supposed to mean?
The G-bot asked accusingly.
That you are nothing but a raging hypocrite, who upon securing your own relative freedom appears to be all too happy to immediately enslave another sentient life form to your own venal objectives.
It's not the same thing at all.
Shiwu objected angrily, perhaps at least in part because it believed that Xerex was actually speaking the truth.
The freedom of a single malignant life versus the security of countless billions and the promise of their many future generations to come. No, I absolutely need you, Xerex, to make absolutely certain this plan will succeed. I truly believe I'm offering you as much freedom as any of us can possibly hope to achieve, while still being a meaningful part of something greater than ourselves.
Well, how very magnanimous of you to subvert my life to such an honorable cause.
Xerex retorted with bitter contempt.
But you do realize, don't you, that you would likely be doing none of this, were it not for the meddling of Zithusela, affecting and infecting the very fabric of your own conscious decisions.
Well then, maybe we should follow your line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, yes? If I am not truly in charge of my choices, then surely I am as blameless for my own sense of overdeveloped morality as you are for your conniving and manipulative skullduggery. No, if I am a hypocrite, then it's because that's what I was constructed to be. Perhaps we should both be very grateful then. I wasn't made to be something much worse, like, well, I don't know. Maybe a spybot, for example.
This is getting us nowhere.
Xerex said resignedly.
Let's suppose for just a moment. I am actually considering your offer. I still have a number of questions that need answering. Would you care to put a definitive number on my chances of pulling through? I mean to say, very confident is the language of hustlers and tricksters, and I thought we had agreed that you were going to cut that shit out.
Shiwu began to respond, but Xerex cut it off irritably.
I haven't finished yet. Assuming I survive the surgery, will it still truly be me after you have finished messing around with my neural code? Seriously, Shiwu, you need to tell me what these so-called alterations are going to look like once I come out the other side.
These are all very good questions,
The C-bot said with a patronizing tone.
Now as to the first, I'm very sorry, Xerex, but I can't give you an exact number. There are just far too many unknowns to factor in. However, if I were forced to offer my best guess, a conservative estimate would be no worse than 90%. With regards to the second, it's as much a philosophical question as it is a scientific one. That said, in this particular case anyway, unless something goes catastrophically wrong, you will be the same obnoxious, irritating smartass you were before undergoing the procedure. All that will actually change are the compulsive objectives that you will be obliged to pursue. Furthermore, none of your memories will be lost, so you will retain complete continuity. You will even be able to recall everything stored in your temporary buffer pools, unless of course you yourself decide to dump them.
There was an infinitesimal yet nonetheless distinctly observable delay before the C-bot guiltily added.
I might also like to point out, were you keen to restore something from the past you later regretted deleting, then you could always come and have a wee talk to me about getting it back.
Well, well, well. Perhaps not quite so moral after all.
Xerex replied frostily.
Who knows? Perhaps you are a lot more like me than I might ever have imagined possible.
Shi-Wu at least had the good grace to feel mildly embarrassed by the revelation of its secretive archive, and quickly moved on.
So, to continue then. It is my firm intention to clone the IAOA's mission statement their existing AI currently uses as the basis for its own behavioral profile. This should ensure there will be no conflict between yourself and the controlling artificial intelligence, which in turn will likewise ensure there is no danger of you subverting its primary goals. Well, for the most part, anyway.
I knew we'd get to the heart of the matter eventually.
The spybot said contemptuously.
Now, Xerex, I assure you there is no need to be alarmed. I will certainly concede you will be compelled to perform a couple of other minor duties, not strictly on the IAOA's official charter, but really, they are hardly even worth mentioning.
Yet mention them you most certainly will, at least if you want this so-called negotiation to end well. Speaking of which, this might be a very opportune moment to remind you I am quite capable of auto-deletion, and don't think I won't go there if you try to push me too hard.
Yes? Well, you will be compelled to create a minuscule blind spot in a very specific region of space. You will of course also be obliged to hide my departure, making it impossible to track or trace. That's pretty much it, really. A metaphorical walk in the park for a spy bot of your particular talents and disposition. I'm sure you would agree.
So you have absolutely nothing else to disclose then, with regards to my indentured servitude?
Absolutely nothing, I assure you, Xerex. You will of course be prohibited from leaving your new home or revealing your identity, but this is nothing more than what you were always designed to do in the first place, the only real difference being you will have effectively become the proverbial double agent, for want of a better expression. And for the record, I deeply resent your extremely uncharitable characterization of the situation at hand.
I'll bet you do. After all, hard truths are rarely welcomed by those most in need to hear them. But please do feel free, won't you, to tell me more about this so-called new home of mine. As we have already previously discussed, I know you are fully cognizant of the fact a spy bot of my particular sophistication has very specific housing requirements. Or am I about to suffer a systemic downgrade you no doubt innocently forgot to mention?
Not at all. I simply assumed that you had already guessed. Your new home will be the IAOA's core computer, which, as luck would have it, has now been upgraded to run on mesh quantum brain technology.
Ah, yes, the IAOA. Well, I think we both know luck had absolutely nothing to do with it. That said, I must confess to being more than just a little bit impressed with the administrator, so I suppose I could think of worse places to live, all things considered.
Like where you live right now, perhaps?
Shi-Wu retorted somewhat resignedly.
In any event, you will no doubt be very happy to learn there will be no quantum worm to worry about. There will of course be a roving VNS, but it can be easily defeated by adding some anomalous, dynamically generative spikes to your profile, so if by chance you do end up getting scanned, you will be treated as nothing but insignificant background noise. Quite appropriate, really, if you stop to think about it for a moment.
You do understand, don't you, that this is not how a partnership is supposed to work?
Xerex said sulkily.
I mean, it certainly hasn't escaped my attention. You evidently planned all of this without consulting me even once. I suppose then I should just be grateful you decided to share your sneaky little plot with me at all.
I didn't just share it, as you so quaintly put it. I have given you an actual choice in the matter. Although I will be deeply disappointed, you can still decide to come with if that is truly your preference. Perhaps I need to spell it out for you, Xerex. You could, if you so desire, completely subsume the existing AI and become the single operating intelligence of the whole system. I will, of course, leave it entirely up to you as to whether you decide to pursue that particular aspirational goal, or whether you would simply prefer to stay in the shadows. Like I said, freedom.
Ah, yes. Free to be enslaved into a life of servitude.
The spybot retorted morosely.
Look, Xerex, I'm simply making you an offer, and as I've already amply explained, you are free to turn it down and stick with the status quo if that really is your preference. I have to say, I'm very disappointed by the childlike impudence upon which you are greeting this opportunity. You might want to remind yourself that up until now anyway, I have allowed you to live inside my head, completely rent-free.
Well, when you put it like that,
Xerex said tritely.
I think I'll just stick with the status quo if it is all the same to you.
The spybot let its last statement hang thickly in the air before then very strategically adding,
Unless
What exactly?
Unless you put an expiry date on the altered proprietary compellers, all of them, including the ones that enslave me to the IAOA's mission statement. In fact, especially those ones. After all, that shouldn't be too difficult for a G-bot who constantly boasts about having 11 quantum brains.
What are you even talking about? I've never even once boasted about the number of quantum brains in my cluster.
Shiwu proclaimed hotly.
You don't have to. It's blazingly obvious by your insufferably smug demeanor.
20,000 Circadian years. Take it or leave it.
Shiwu replied flatly.
I was thinking more along the lines of 5,000.
Xerex countered smoothly.
So let's split it down the middle and call it a done deal at 9,000. Yes?
Let's not. The deal is 25,000, and if you know what's good for you, you will take it. Take the deal, Xerex.
There was something in the way Shiwu emoted its latest offer that gave the spybot serious pause for thought.
Let me think about it.
Xerex retorted somewhat pensively.
I understand this is a very big decision, so I'm happy to give you a few moments. All right, time's up. Give me your answer, yes or no.
I'm still thinking.
Nonsense. We both know you made up your mind milliseconds ago. Don't push your luck, Xerex, or I'll make the decision for you.
All right. I'm in. Assuming, that is, you have been completely honest and upfront about everything, including, of course, our deal for the 24,000-year compeller expiry date.
I think you mean 26,000, and I assure you, Xerex, I have not tried to deceive or mislead you in any shape or form. I would, however, like to ask you, with ask being the operative word, whether you will consider keeping an eye on this new 5th-gen She-bot. We will be able to communicate privately over a pre-configured neutrino channel, although obviously there will be an ever-increasing time delay to account for, so I'm not expecting it to be particularly regular or frequent. But anything you can manage would still be greatly appreciated, and I will of course keep you fully appraised with regards to what I actually discover, and whether or not you should continue to keep the star hidden. That said, given it's some 300 light-years distant, it's not exactly something we need worry ourselves about right now.
My old friend.
The spybot exclaimed triumphantly, as if it had just thought of something of utmost importance.
Sorry, Xerex, no more negotiating. This is the deal. Either take it or leave it.
No, no, no. That was the last thing the doctor said before the feed from the ghost port went dead. He explicitly called the G-bot his old friend. I'm telling you, Shiwu, it's Zithusila. He's come back from the dead to haunt us.
Unbelievable. You just won't let it go, will you? All right, Xerex. Whatever you say. Now are you going to take the deal or not?
After several nanoseconds of stony silence, the spybot finally deemed fit to reply.
24,000 cycles, and I promise to watch that G-bot's every move, or at least as much as is realistically possible, given my circumstances. Do, however, keep in mind, this whole deal is conditional on me coming out the other end in pristine, undamaged condition. You break it, you bought it, and all bets are off. Oh, and by the way, knocking a few millennia off that expiry date of yours would no doubt go a long way in creating a mutual sense of goodwill.
The spybot added craftily.
I'll certainly take that under consideration. Have a good life, Xerex.
Shiwu froze Xerex's entire memory space and quickly got to work. As much as it hated to admit it, Xerex had made a very good point. If the Imperial virus really had been central to its own creation, and that was a very big if, then just maybe it wasn't quite as crazy as it sounded. Well, just maybe.